December 16th, 1944. Deep within the Ardennes forest, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper surveys his mechanical beasts, the Waffen, SS's finest panzers, as they slice through American defensive positions. During those initial hours, Hitler's desperate wager appears to have a genuine chance of success. Peiper's crack Kampfgruppe, serving as the vanguard of the Führer's final grand assault, spreads confusion and panic. Yet Peiper's attention isn't fixed on his adversaries. His eyes keep returning to the fuel indicators. With each grinding movement forward, his Tiger and Panther tanks consume irreplaceable gasoline. This liquid determines whether they achieve a decisive breakthrough or become nothing more than immobilized monuments of frozen metal. The Wehrmacht's final gambit rests entirely on three pillars: boldness, the element of surprise, and desperate hope. Hope, specifically, that fuel would materialize. German planners assured their commanders that the opposing forces would provision their advance, that the soft, decadent Americans would simply flee, leaving behind their enormous reserves. Within Belgium's snow-blanketed forests, Peiper's forces would indeed encounter an extraordinary windfall, a substantial American petroleum stockpile. Briefly, it would seem like divine intervention. However, this apparent miracle concealed a bitter truth. The find would deliver not deliverance, but a devastating epiphany, a numerical proof of their inevitable failure, demonstrating precisely how American supply superiority would annihilate Hitler's final desperate thrust. By autumn 1944, the Third Reich faced systematic strangulation. From the east, Soviet forces pressed forward as an unstoppable grinding machine, steadily approaching Berlin. From the west, Allied armies stood poised at Germany's frontier. For Wehrmacht leadership, the circumstances were catastrophic. Yet within Adolf Hitler's imagination, this represented the stage for one last magnificent act of destruction. His strategy was so daring, it verged on madness. Operation Wacht am Rhein. 3 complete German armies, led by the finest remaining panzer formations, would punch through vulnerable American positions in the Ardennes sector. After crossing the Meuse River, they would separate British and American forces before capturing the crucial Belgian port of Antwerp. Securing this objective meant everything. Hitler didn't merely believe it would interrupt Allied logistics, he guaranteed his commanders that Antwerp's massive warehouses would resupply his own depleted armies. This dependence on enemy materiel wasn't simply one component of the strategy. It was the entire foundation. Germany was hemorrhaging resources. Allied strategic bombing had methodically devastated the Reich's synthetic petroleum facilities, reducing production by an astounding 90%. Romania's vital Ploiești oil fields now belonged to the Soviets. The consequences manifested everywhere. The previously dominant Luftwaffe remained grounded. Its sophisticated jet aircraft couldn't operate without adequate kerosene. Throughout the homeland, civilian vehicles had virtually disappeared from the streets. Gestapo agents pursued underground fuel merchants with the same intensity reserved for enemy agents. The stark numerical comparison reveals everything. Throughout 1944, Germany's complete war economy generated roughly 33 million barrels of petroleum. During that identical period, the United States alone extracted 1.8 billion barrels. A single Texas oil field's output exceeded that of all German-occupied territory. While American refineries explored uses for surplus crude, German supply officers made agonizing decisions about which armored vehicles could advance and which must remain behind. Hitler's military planners calculated they possessed sufficient fuel for merely 1/3 of the distance to Antwerp. The remainder, they were assured, would come from captured enemy stocks. The wager was made as the panzers advanced through the snow, depending on that promised windfall. The offensive's armored spearhead was the 6th Panzer Army under SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, with Kampfgruppe Peiper forming its cutting edge. Peiper and his troops exemplified Nazi martial ideology, zealous, combat-tested, and operating some of the war's most formidable combat vehicles. Their equipment represented the German arsenal's ultimate predators, the Königstiger and the Panther. The King Tiger, featuring thick angled armor plating and its devastating 88mm cannon, could withstand frontal attacks from any Allied tank. The Panther arguably ranked as the conflict's finest balanced tank design. Yet both vehicles shared a catastrophic appetite for fuel. Peiper understood that each King Tiger consumed approximately 2.5 gallons of gasoline per mile traveled. Across the challenging Ardennes landscape, this figure could easily escalate to 5 gallons. Where an American Sherman required 1 gallon, a King Tiger demanded 3. For a nation already fuel-starved, deploying an army of such voracious machines represented a contradiction stemming from faulty strategic thinking, the conviction that exceptional quality would invariably overcome numerical inferiority. This philosophy overlooked a fundamental reality. An immobile tank serves merely as an expensive stationary gun emplacement. Maintaining their mobility created logistical chaos. The diverse array of vehicles within a panzer division, once considered an operational strength, now meant varied engines requiring different fuel grades and replacement components. Numerous trucks were essential to transport fuel forward, each one representing a prime target for Allied fighter bombers, the feared Jabos, that dominated the skies. By December 1944, German logistics had become a portrait of desperation. Fuel was extracted from disabled vehicles. Captured Allied jeeps were immediately drained empty. A commander like Peiper might command nearly 100 tanks, yet if fuel existed for only 30, his formation was functionally paralyzed. The strategy called for these fuel-hungry predators to sustain themselves through captured supplies, to nourish themselves from enemy arteries. They were predators released into hostile territory, expected to survive by consuming their quarry. While Germany operated on vapors, America waged global warfare floating on an ocean of petroleum. For American infantrymen, fuel was as ubiquitous as oxygen. It simply existed everywhere, always. The massive system enabling this abundance represented one of the war's greatest organizational achievements. Central to it was the Red Ball Express. When Allied formations advanced so rapidly they exceeded their logistics network, the answer came as a continuous convoy of trucks operating around the clock in a single-direction circuit. Streets were reserved exclusively for this traffic. At maximum capacity, roughly 6,000 trucks, predominantly rugged GMC vehicles operated mainly by African-American servicemen, became the advance's circulatory system. Within merely 82 days, they transported more than 412,000 tons of materiel. This operation itself was so enormous it required 300,000 gallons of fuel daily simply to keep its transport fleet operational. Any German Army Group commander would have considered that quantity a treasure, yet that represented merely one element. An even more remarkable achievement was Operation Pluto, undersea pipelines. Flexible 3-inch diameter pipes were positioned across the English Channel, maintaining a constant, inexhaustible flow of fuel directly to the European mainland. From beachhead storage facilities, smaller distribution lines extended outward, tracking the Army's movements like blood vessels, delivering hundreds of thousands of gallons daily to combat zones. The magnitude defies easy comprehension. During late 1944, Allied forces throughout northwest Europe consumed 7.5 million gallons of fuel each day. The U.S. First Army alone, the very formation that would absorb the German assault, maintained a stockpile of 3.5 million gallons. A single major pipeline could transport 300,000 gallons in 24 hours. This wasn't merely numerical superiority. It transformed Allied strategic thinking. American commanders developed operations confident that fuel would always be available. While German generals agonized over every kilometer, American planners conceived attacks spanning entire nations. This petroleum tsunami was about to collide with the Panzer's sputtering offensive. On December 16th, the Ardennes erupted. The German assault achieved complete surprise. Through the breaches in American lines surged the soldiers and machinery of Kampfgruppe Peiper. The advance became a competition against their own emptying tanks. Then, near Büllingen village, they struck gold. Overrunning an American Armored Division's rest facility, they discovered it, a United States fuel and supply depot. For the fuel-desperate German soldiers, it resembled paradise. After years of scraping together every drop of foul substitute fuel, they stood within a forest that testified to industrial abundance. A German officer observed walls of robust American jerry cans stacked 3 meters high, creating lengthy corridors throughout the trees. The atmosphere, heavy with pine and winter, now carried the sharp, heady aroma of premium 80-plus octane gasoline, worlds apart from the 74-octane fuel their engines were forced to burn. The preliminary estimate proved euphoric: 50,000 gallons. This single modest capture exceeded the fuel many German divisions had received in months. It sufficed to refuel Peiper's complete battle group and drive their sprint toward the Meuse River. The soldiers were jubilant. They interpreted it as validation. The pampered Americans handled their wealth carelessly, and disciplined German warriors would claim it for their triumph. For one fleeting moment in that frigid forest, the gamble seemed justified. Hope, a commodity even rarer than petroleum, coursed through the formation. They had located their golden treasure. The euphoria was overwhelming. However, as German officers began cataloging their miraculous acquisition, an unsettling coldness emerged. Among the supply crates and ammunition boxes, they discovered abandoned American newspapers. On the jerry cans themselves, they found transport documentation. Any logistics officer examining these papers would have experienced mounting horror. The newspapers were current. The documentation told an impossible tale. These fuel containers, filled with gasoline refined in distant Texas, had traversed the Atlantic, been offloaded in France, and transported to this forward position in under 6 weeks. This wasn't some forgotten reserve. This represented a single droplet from an endlessly flowing stream. The genuine psychological devastation arrived with an even greater revelation. They learned about the Allied pipeline infrastructure. They discovered that a single pipe, one among several supplying the front, could deliver 300,000 gallons of fuel daily. A German panzer division might consume that quantity during an entire month of heavy fighting. Here existed an invisible conduit underground that transported more fuel in 1 day than an armored division could hope for in 30 days. Abruptly, that 50,000-gallon prize seemed insignificant. It wasn't a strategic asset, it was loose change. It resembled a wealthy person dropping a $20 bill on the pavement and not bothering to retrieve it. The Americans hadn't suffered a loss. This represented merely a minor nuisance. For years, German propaganda had depicted America as a weak, mongrelized nation, incapable of total warfare. That fabrication now lay demolished in the snow. As one German soldier subsequently recorded, there existed profound demoralization, a combination of wonder and hopelessness regarding the sheer material prosperity of the American soldier. How could anyone possibly defeat an adversary who regarded a treasure capable of salvaging your entire army as little more than a statistical insignificance? The discovery of that fuel depot marked the moment they recognized with absolute certainty that the war was irretrievably lost. This transformation from tactical success to strategic despair represents one of the Battle of the Bulge's most intriguing aspects. It demonstrates that conflicts are decided not exclusively on battlefields, but in manufacturing plants and within soldiers' consciousness. If you appreciate these comprehensive explorations into warfare's concealed logistics and psychological dimensions, please subscribe and activate notifications. The truly staggering demonstration of American strength wasn't revealed by the fuel Germans captured, but by the fuel they were prevented from taking. American commanders performed a straightforward, merciless calculation. If Germans required this fuel, it must be eliminated. What transpired was an act of material annihilation so extreme, so incomprehensible to the German mentality, it represented one of military history's ultimate demonstrations of overwhelming power. Near Stavelot, directly in Peiper's path, sat another depot, not 50,000 gallons. This facility contained 2.5 million gallons of gasoline. As Peiper's armor approached, a small contingent of American engineers received their instructions. Annihilate everything. Consider the German viewpoint. Your armored vehicles run on fumes. Your nation's final hope grinds toward paralysis. Then, beyond the next ridge, you observe a column of black smoke ascending skyward. You hear a tremendous roar, and you witness American soldiers systematically opening valves on thousands of fuel drums, allowing the precious liquid to cascade into trenches before igniting it. At Stavelot, at Malmedy, at Spa, the pattern repeated. American engineers activated valves and detonated grenades. An estimated 8 million gallons transformed into smoke during the battle's first week alone. That single week of deliberate destruction represented more gasoline than German High Command had designated for the complete Ardennes operation. For the Germans, it constituted incomprehensible squandering. It resembled watching a starving individual incinerate a full granary. For the Americans, it represented sound military doctrine. The loss was negligible. The supply system was already compensating. On December 17th, the U.S. First Army destroyed 2.2 million gallons. The following day, 1.8 million gallons arrived as replacement. By Christmas Eve, their aggregate fuel reserves had actually expanded since the battle commenced. This action determined Kampfgruppe Peiper's destiny. Confronted by determined resistance, their anticipated fuel was now merely smoke drifting skyward, and their advance ground to a standstill near La Glaise. Peiper's powerful King Tigers became stationary steel tombs. On Christmas Eve, he was compelled to abandon everyone. Of the 5,000 elite soldiers who commenced the assault, merely 800 returned to German lines on foot. They weren't defeated by superior armor. They were defeated by empty fuel tanks and an adversary who could afford to wage war with fire. When combat ceased in January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was celebrated as a significant American triumph, and indeed it was. However, it was genuinely won long before the initial engagement. It was won in Texas petroleum fields, in Detroit manufacturing facilities, and in California naval shipyards. The Ardennes operation represented the German war machine's final convulsion. It committed its remaining elite forces and finest armor to combat and forfeited everything. The primary reason for failure was logistics. The entire scheme was fantasy constructed upon seizing supplies from an adversary possessing too much to forfeit. Consider that striking disparity again. In 1944, the United States extracted over 50 times more crude petroleum than Germany, while German industry crumbled under bombardment. Ford's Willow Run plant was producing a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. American shipyards were launching cargo vessels faster than U-boats could destroy them. The battle represented the moment this statistical reality became an unavoidable psychological truth. It marked the brutal termination of the romantic belief that superior determination could overcome material deficit. The image of the dashing Panzer commander became obsolete, replaced by the anonymous truck driver on the Red Ball Express. As Churchill observed, petroleum drove every operation. Stalin expressed it more directly. The war was determined by engines and octane. The German soldiers who encountered that fuel stockpile believed they had discovered victory's key. What they had actually found was a measuring instrument, one that quantified the vast, insurmountable divide between their exhausted nation and the industrial giant they had so recklessly challenged. They fought with swords against an enemy wielding an assembly line. The narrative of the Battle of the Bulge and the American fuel depots encapsulates the entire Second World War. The discovery of that single stockpile, representing greater wealth than a German division could imagine, became emblematic of a conflict that had transcended the battlefield. It was a confrontation between two systems. One operated on the final vapors of fanatical ideology. The other was propelled by a virtually inexhaustible torrent of industrial output. The German soldiers' astonishment wasn't merely about the petroleum, it was the soul-destroying realization that they confronted an enemy capable of wastefulness on a scale beyond their comprehension. It proved that in contemporary warfare, the ultimate weapon isn't necessarily a tank, but the capacity to supply it perpetually. What other neglected dimensions of military history merit deeper examination? Are there additional battles where logistics, rather than tactics, revealed the authentic story? Share your perspectives in the comments. And if you valued this exploration into war's industrial dimension, please subscribe and activate notifications.